When I first laid eyes on the human-designated Helen inside the sterile containment unit of Water Purification Camp 4, her wrists were deadlocked to the quarantine cot by medical-grade restraints. Her ragged hazard suit was caked in neon-green sludge and pungent fungal spores, and the scratches on her arms were already festering, yet her eyes held absolutely zero fear of death. Quite the opposite, actually. She looked at me like I was a fragile infant who couldn't even survive a common cold. That should have been my first red flag, a glaring warning of the catastrophic miscalculation our interstellar medical fleet had made, but I was completely oblivious. Let me rewind to one cycle ago. My name is Sarah, Director of the Alliance Biodefense Division. Our first protocol upon occupying Earth was simple and absolute: confiscate all modern pharmaceuticals. Every nano-antibody, synthetic serum, and gene repair stimulant was systematically incinerated. Stripped of advanced medicine, we assumed they would be nothing more than fragile meat sacks at the mercy of Mother Nature. It was a foolproof strategy that had worked flawlessly across countless star systems. Species stripped of their medical tech would drop dead from a stiff breeze. And yet, when we went up against the human immune system, we found out just how laughably wrong we were. Carl's heavy armor boots sank into the ankle-deep rainforest muck with a wet, sickening squelch. The exosuit's servos whined as they yanked half a ton of plating out of the sludge, showering decayed leaves and rot with every step. 20 of the Alliance's most elite shock troopers fanned out in a tactical skirmish line. The hermetic seal indicators on their biosuits glowed a steady optimal blue, and the nanofilters at their collars pinged a self-diagnostic every 3 seconds. Just as stable as they were back in the sterile training sims on the homeworld. Carl tapped his wrist terminal, and a flood of telemetry washed over the hollow display. 0 synthetic explosives, 0 weaponized gas molecules, 0 trace of energy weapons. The screen was so packed with bright green safe indicators, it practically blinded him. Those desk jockeys at HQ are just milking the budget. A trooper behind him scoffed, violently kicking a rotting stump before unlatching his redundant toxin filter module and tossing it into his back storage. Look at this shithole. Ain't no bioweapons out here. Hell, you can't even find a synthetic molecule to tickle our respiratory tracts, and they call this the galaxy's deadliest hellscape? A chorus of mechanical laughter erupted across the squad. One trooper even slung his energy rifle over his shoulder, freeing up a hand to idly bat at the massive broadleaf vines hanging in his face. Carl let out a tight smirk. He had led purges against resistance cells across 7 primitive civilizations, and he had never seen a battlefield so completely devoid of threat. Humanity couldn't even cobble together a decent kinetic weapon, so there was no way that elusive phantom resistance fighter everyone whispered about was going to take down a heavy armor squad by throwing rocks. The moment the vanguard trooper's gauntlet brushed the edge of that broadleaf, the treads of his boots snapped a thin vine buried deep in the humus with a sharp crack. Instantly, over a dozen crude burlap sacks rigged in the canopy above burst open in perfect synchronization. A torrential downpour of milky white oleander sap mixed with shredded leaves rained down on them, thick with bright yellow fungal spores that completely blacked out their visors. The 2 troopers at the rear had the reflexes to shield their helmets, but the viscous plant slurry had already seeped through the intake grills of their suits. It clogged the precision-engineered synthetic air valves completely, choking off even a single molecule of outside air. Carl's tactical terminal, previously purring with green safety bars, instantly exploded into a chaotic mess of error codes. The nanofilters on all 20 biosuits, which had just been flashing their rhythmic 3-second pulses, suddenly locked into a blinding, bloody red. A piercing chorus of alarm klaxons completely jammed the squad's comms channel. Carl slammed his thumb onto the wide area environmental scan. High energy beams swept through the swirling cloud of yellow spores, code cascading down his holo screen for 3 agonizing seconds before locking onto a bright green prompt. No synthetic toxins detected. Environment secure. A nerve twitched in his temple. The suffocating yellow fog choking out his entire squad was classified as safe. Before he could even mash the hardware diagnostic button, the hulking trooper behind him dived straight into the ankle-deep rot, helmet speakers broadcasting a horrific, wheezing death rattle that sounded like a busted bellows. The red hazard lights on their nano filters pulsed violently. These top-of-the-line filters, boasted to catch any particle under 0.1 microns, were about as useful as wet tissue paper against these naturally occurring spores that hadn't seen a single tweak of genetic engineering. The comms channel erupted into a slaughterhouse of screams. One trooper, hallucinating wildly, mistook his buddy's raised rifle for a lunging apex predator and squeezed the trigger. The brilliant blue plasma bolt punched straight through 2 biosuit chest plates, roasting the swamp mud until it hissed with white steam. 20 elite shock troopers, veterans who had conquered 7 primitive worlds without a scratch, never even caught a glimpse of the enemy before they were rolling around in knee-deep sludge, dying. Men were clawing at their own throats, crushing their own helmets, firing wild plasma bursts that blew apart giant tree roots. Carl tried to swallow the salty, viscous fluid welling up in his throat, but the moment his finger grazed his trigger, he lost all motor function in his limbs. The final medical prompt that flashed across his dying terminal read, "Acute anaphylactic shock. Vital signs terminating in T-10 seconds. 20 tactical displays flatlined in perfect unison. The jungle breeze casually swept the yellow spores over a graveyard of tangled armor. I scoured that combat telemetry report for the 3rd time, and every single line felt like taking a fistful of Earth's toxic mud straight to the eyeballs. No synthetic toxins, no nanotech signatures, no genetically modified pathogens. The only anomalous samples were flagged as oleander sap, unidentified fungal spores, and common mugwort pollen. Carl's squad, my ace in the whole team that had helped me pacify 7 distinct alien resistance movements, had been wiped out without sending a single distress beacon. I stared at the automated cause of death for a solid 10 seconds, convinced it was a glitch. Mass acute anaphylactic shock, accompanied by friendly fire high-energy weapon discharge. I whipped my head around to glare at the isolation cot. The human, Helen, was locked down with maximum security molecular restraints on her wrists and ankles, her festering arm wound still slowly oozing. Right now, she was just lazily watching me through half-lidded eyes, her jaw working slowly as she chewed on God knows what. I had strip-searched her 3 times. I had pried away every piece of metallic jewelry, incinerated everything on her person that could even theoretically hold a charge, and personally dug out her damn alloy dental fillings. There was 0 mathematical probability she was hiding high-tech ordnance. I closed the distance in a single stride, my exosuit boots cracking against the sterile anti-slip flooring. I jammed a pale, chitinous finger right in her face, roaring loud enough to make the overhead UV sterilization lights flicker. What kind of invisible nanobioweapon did you deploy in that jungle? Alliance R&D spent 3 million credits on those filters. You expect me to believe my men were choked out by common pollen? Cut the botanical bullshit. She let out a sudden grating bark of laughter. The sheer mockery in her tone was like a rusted needle slipping right between my armor plates. Before I could demand answers, her jaw muscles bulged. I had personally supervised the extraction of her metallic fillings, never dreaming that wedged deep in the crevices of her teeth were 3 dried, unassuming tree seeds, which she was now crushing with sheer barbaric human bite force. The next second, she thrust her neck forward and spat. Saliva, laced with hyperacidic digestive enzymes, shot like a fiery dart and landed dead center on the molecular restraint cuffing her left wrist. Acrid white smoke instantly began to hiss and plume. The highest tier hazard alarm, clipped to my waist, shrieked without warning. That military-grade molecular lock, a million-credit Alliance marvel rated to withstand 3,000 degrees of plasma fire, melted like styrofoam hit with lye. Within 2 seconds, it corroded into a blackened, gaping hole. The magnetic lock let out a crisp snap and completely died. Helen rolled her newly freed wrist, joints popping with loud, sickening cracks. Before I could even raise my blaster, she violently shoved up the left sleeve of her hazard suit, exposing the infected bloody gash I had inspected earlier. The wound, which had been a horrific mess of raw meat, was now covered by a thick, dark brown scab. Not a single drop of inflammatory fluid seeped from its edges. The healthy tissue around it was already stitching itself back together. She flicked her eyes toward my tentacles, which were shaking so badly I could barely hold my sidearm, and a mocking sneer pulled at her lips. "Y'all burned our synthetic meds. Strip searched me down to my fillings, and figured I'd just lay down and rot without a prescription." She drawled, digging a dirty fingernail into the hard scab and flicking a dried flake onto the pristine, sterile examination table. "The macrophages swimming in human blood are born killer bots, buddy. Don't need no charging, don't need no code. They see a bug that ain't mine. They tear it to shreds. That little jungle rot. Starved 'em for 3 days, and they ate it clean down to the bone." Several hours prior, inside the frontline medical tent of Water Purification Camp 4. The chief medical officer pressed 3 sets of operating tentacles onto the calibration keys of the diagnostic bays, but the screens just vomited red error codes. 27 patrol troopers lay paralyzed on the freezing alloy tables. Every single one of them had a microscopic speck of green fuzz stuck to their shoulder armor. They had just been on a routine perimeter patrol when they brushed against the venomous spines of a dangling caterpillar. He had pumped 3 doses of premium anti-allergen nanobots straight into their jugulars, but those ridiculously expensive micro-machines just did laps in their bloodstream, totally unable to lock onto a target. The all-natural caterpillar toxin had absolutely 0 synthetic signatures. The Alliance's medical database, built over 10,000 years of iterations, didn't have a single match. The troopers' exposed respiratory gills swelled and turned bruised purple in real time, their fingertips gouging deep white grooves into the alloy tables. He viciously kicked aside a half-empty crate of unused nanofilters. 3 million credits in R&D, and the damn things couldn't even filter out the grass pollen blowing into the tent. Just as his last patient stopped convulsing, the perimeter alarm mounted on the tent pole flashed blinding red. System failure warnings flooded every comms channel like a tidal wave. The 3 heavy patrol mechs stationed on the defensive line went totally dark before they could even transmit a final damage report. The 3 tentacles gripping my energy pistol convulsed violently, slipping off the cold, hard grip. The gun hit the nano-coated sterile deck with a heavy clatter. Almost instantly, the base-wide siren detonated. The sonic force shook the ceiling lights so hard that sterilization glass rained down in shards. The electronic lock on the blast doors screamed 3 consecutive error chimes before caving inward, warped by catastrophic external force, the hydraulic pistons shrieking in agony. 2 towering heavy royal guards, easily standing 2 meters tall in their pristine white bio-armor, smashed through the ruined bulkhead. Their high-energy lasers were fully charged, the pale blue plasma muzzles locking dead onto Helen's skull. Orders blared over the comms, shaking with panicked static. "Terminate all detained targets on sight. 3 perimeter mechs are dark. Defenses are overrun by hostile bioagents. Kill on sight." I backed up against a scorching hot terminal, kicking aside half a box of empty nano syringes Helen had knocked over. My terminal was spamming red critical health alerts from dying soldiers, and I didn't even dare to breathe. I knew the destructive yield of those laser rifles. They could melt 1/2 meter of solid bulkhead into slag in a microsecond. But Helen didn't even flinch. She stood calmly amid the scorched black ruin of her melted restraints, casually raising a finger to wipe the acid residue from her lip. She sized up the blinding, targeting lasers of the Royal Guard, and there was no fear of execution in her eyes. She looked like a backwoods hunter picking out which hog to slaughter first. She scraped her right boot against the floor, digging a finger into a seam lining the boot's inner shaft, a seam I had scanned 800 times and dismissed as a fabric fold. Out came a crude, pitted stone mortar, edges still crusted with plant residue. Immediately after, she yanked out a haphazardly stitched burlap sack, glowing a vicious, bloody red. My terminal's molecular scanner spasmed before spitting out a reading. No synthetic hazards. Natural plant fiber. Dehydrated organic tissue. Threat level 0. I barely had time to exhale when she twisted the bag open and dumped a handful of dried, blisteringly red ghost peppers into her palm. Before I could react, she popped 3 or 4 straight into her mouth, the sickening crunch of the dried husks echoing like gunshots in the dead, silent room. My air samplers spiked into the red zone, but the system ran 3 rapid verifications and stubbornly output a green safe, non-synthetic gas, 100% intercept capacity message. I watched in horror as she chewed, a fine red mist sweating from her face. The pungent, aggressive spice leaking from her teeth flooded the room. She actually closed her eyes in bliss, then tilted her head with sniper precision toward the intake valve of the room's air recycler. Taking a deep chestful of air, she violently exhaled a searing breath of saliva and vapor directly into the vent. That million-credit military-grade nanofilter had never been programmed to block plant alkaloids. Its core logic dictated that only synthetic toxins were threats. The aerosolized red mist expelled from her lungs passed right through the molecular mesh, like it wasn't even there. The Royal Guard on the left suddenly jerked, his laser rifle drooping 1/2 inch as his muscles seized. Through the bottom of his visor, I watched his blue respiratory gills balloon into translucent, swollen sacs, choking off his airway in a matter of seconds. He couldn't even trigger a distress signal, just emitting a horrific, rattling wheeze. His armored gauntlets tore wildly at his helmet, metallic fingers leaving deep gouges in the reinforced plastic before all 200 kilos of heavy armor crashed onto the sterile deck, sending my empty nanosyringes skittering everywhere. The second guard on the right followed less than 2 seconds later. The vitals monitor on his helm exploded into blood red. Before his finger could even brush the panic button, he rigidified and face planted hard into his partner's armor, the heavy plating smashing a row of sampling tubes into white splinters. The tentacles holding my terminal went completely numb. The air sampling data was cascading in corrupted gibberish, every identification protocol crashing. A defense matrix that took my department a decade's worth of budget to build had just been turned into Swiss cheese by 2 breaths of ghost pepper. Outside on the basalt patrol perimeter, 3 heavy patrol mechs were crushing gravel at top speed, burning rubber toward the interrogation wing. Their helm comms were swamped with the dying screams of the Royal Guards. 3 mech jockeys had their knuckles white on the energy triggers, ready to vaporize anything that breached quarantine. Suddenly, the hydraulic gauge on the lead mech slammed to absolute 0. The pilot spat a vicious alien curse and pounded his console. The onboard virus scanner ran 3 sweeps, reporting 0 threats, no synthetic bioweapons, no nanite incursions. Before he could recalibrate, the heavy yoke locked up dead in his hands, completely unresponsive. The second mech started bleeding a brownish-green sludge laced with white mycelium from its motive joints. The top-tier synthetic hydraulic fluid, costing hundreds of thousands of credits, was being eaten into a thin, watery gruel right before their eyes. The servo motor in the mech's right leg blew a blinding shower of sparks, and the 200-ton steel behemoth collapsed into the dirt, tracks digging a half-meter trench. The engine block of the third mech instantly erupted in thick, toxic black smoke. The intake fans were plastered with a proprietary blend of decomposing fungal spores Helen had smeared on the grills 3 days ago during her recon sweep. These primeval fungi, spawned in the Amazonian mud, didn't exist in the Alliance's databases. They treated alien industrial lubricants like an all-you-can-eat buffet, chewing through the fuel line straight to the power core, degrading every transmission medium into a puddle of putrid water in less than 10 seconds. The terminal in my grip suddenly spat a blinding blue-white spark. The screen, which had been vomiting code for half an hour, hard crashed, wiping all environmental parameters to 0. The air recycler, warped by the concussive force of the pepper blast, let out a dull thud. The hermetically sealed gasket fractured, opening a gap barely the width of a hair. A wisp of raw primeval earth air, thick with the wet rot of green grass, slithered in. Before I could even reach for the emergency purge switch, the alarms inside my helmet screamed, "Unregistered allergen detected. Immune system overload 97%. Acute sepsis triggered." It felt like a branding iron had been shoved down my windpipe straight into my stomach. Every organ ruptured with searing pain simultaneously, and my limbs lost all structural integrity. The terminal crashed to the floor as I collapsed, scattering the empty syringes. I tried to reach the energy pistol lying a half-meter away, but my tentacles were as limp as soggy moss. The strength to pull a trigger had totally evaporated. I craned my limp neck upward. Helen was casually stepping over the 2 royal guards who were still thrashing on the floor, crushing glass vials in their death throes. She tucked the pitted stone mortar under her arm, the red burlap sack still gaping open to reveal half a dark red ghost pepper. She was still chewing. The toxic, spicy fumes radiating from her teeth permeated the room, and my suit's hazard alarm screamed until the speakers blew. She crouched next to my paralyzed body, her rough fingers holding a piece of orange peel caked in a thick layer of blue-green mold, hovering it directly over my visor's intake valve. That bizarre, acidic tang, a scent entirely absent from the Alliance toxin registry, wafted right through the hairline crack in the seal. My immune system, already redlining at 97%, took the hit like a sledgehammer, and my entire body went into uncontrollable convulsions. The very next second, her calloused knuckles violently wrenched the molecular lock off my visor. With a sickening crunch, the seal broke, and a mouthful of salty, feral earth air flooded my lungs. Before I could even choke out a death rattle, her fingers, hard as old tree roots, jammed into my jaw hinge. Through sheer brute force, she pried my locked mandibles apart and shoved the moldy orange peel, mixed with charcoal ash from her mortar, straight down my throat. A putrid, bitter, and bizarrely cool, minty sensation exploded in my esophagus. My stomach convulsed, trying to vomit up the garbage, but the agonizing swelling itch that was melting my airway began subsiding at a visible rate. The intact vitals monitor embedded in my wrist began flashing wildly. My allergy index, which had been pinned in the red, plummeted like a rock. The 97% immune overload violently jerked back down into safe parameters. My knuckles rattled uncontrollably against the nano-coated deck. The strobing red and green lights from my wrist monitor bathed my open visor in a chaotic glow. My immune stats kept dropping, and the fire tearing through my internal organs completely dissipated. I had lived for 3 centuries, and I had never seen a biological agent flip a lethal toxin into a miracle cure in seconds. Before I could even process the complete shattering of reality, a rough, soot-stained palm locked into a death grip around the highly sensitive neural antennae atop my head. The sheer force felt like she was going to rip the roots straight out of my skull. The residual ghost pepper oil on her skin brushed against my paper-thin epidermis, instantly triggering a blistering rash of agony. I curled up like a shrimp, completely drained of the will to fight. The mortar under her arm clinked, and Helen shook her free hand, the leftover mold and ash thudding softly inside the stone bowl. Metal shavings from my ruined visor lock were still stuck to her knuckles as she rapped hard against my exposed air intake, a hollow, icy thud. "Stop your damn twitchin'," she growled, her voice low and raspy with the humidity of the jungle. "You're gonna authorize a top-level retreat command right now, and you ain't gonna miss a single keystroke." She jerked her chin down, and my eyes followed the toe of her boot. Wedged in the rubber treads were dark green clumps of fungus, still wet with Amazonian black mud, the exact same strain that had melted through 200 tons of mech armor plating in 10 seconds. "Try anything stupid, and I'll shove this wad of mud straight into your base's primary water supply," she stated coldly, the ghost pepper crunching loudly between her teeth. A fine red mist drifted from her lips, and my air quality alarms instantly maxed out. "And what goes up to your orbital fleets? Water scrubbers won't just be some moldy orange peel. It'll be amoebas that been marinating in the Amazon for millions of years. Your whole armada of soft-shell pussies, who can't even handle a stiff breeze, will melt down to soup, armor and all." Up in low Earth orbit, half a dozen shattered holo projectors rolled across the non-slip alloy deck of the flagship's command bridge. Blinding red hazard lights washed over Supreme Commander USS, his face covered in silver-gray keratin scales that were now trembling violently. Every single sector of his hollow wall was glitching. Thousands of distress beacons from ground garrisons were spamming the feed at 30 pings a second. A patrol unit at the North African outpost had walked past a blooming cactus patch, and all 23 troops had their respiratory gills swell into sealed water balloons. In the European camp, a handful of sycamore seeds drifted into a vent, instantly melting their 2 million credit nanofilters into industrial sludge. Even the atmospheric recon frigates hovering in the stratosphere were completely fried. A few dandelion spores had blown up from the surface, causing the shipboard bioscanners to overload and catch fire. The pile of ruined nanofilters in the corner reached his knees. That was a decade of his biodefense budget, the absolute apex of Alliance tech, meant to scrub cosmic-level bioweapons. Right now, they couldn't even stop common Earth weeds. USS kicked over a pile of empty anti-allergen crates, the scales on the back of his neck standing on end in pure terror. In all the telemetry he had received, humanity hadn't fired a single plasma shot. His entire armada was getting slaughtered by grass and pollen blow-in in the wind. The comms channels were a madhouse of wailing captains, all begging to spool up the hyperdrives and run as far away from this toxic spore rock as possible. Before USS could hit the override alarm, an encrypted channel flickered in the corner of his screen. It was the chopped feed from Ceres unit. The human, Helen, was chomping on a blistering red plant, holding Sarah by the neural antennae like a newborn pup. The dark green fungus pasted to the heel of her boot practically blinded USS with its implied threat. His brain's combat stimulant gland instantly redlined, dropping his courage parameters into the absolute negative. He didn't even have the strength to reach for his sidearm. With trembling fingers, he slotted his master key into the command console. The moment he pressed down, the fleet-wide biometric evacuation order was encrypted and fired through the atmosphere, plummeting straight down to that shattered, sterile interrogation room on Earth. The micro-display on my wrist burned like a brand. The encrypted orbital signal smashed through my ruined terminal's firewall, and the ultimate retinal authorization retreat prompt hijacked my optic nerve. It was US's signature. He hadn't hesitated for a damn microsecond. My fingers were shaking so violently I couldn't hold on to anything, my knee knocking an empty nano syringe box across the floor with a pathetic plastic rattle. I thought of the final transmission from the North African outpost 10 minutes ago. 23 brothers dead from asphyxiation, their gills choked purple, lacking the strength to even hit the comms button. I spent 12 years climbing to the rank of Biodefense Director, bleeding 3 million credits and a decade of budget into a global planetary defense grid, and we were losing to a piece of rough rock picked out of a riverbed. Helen tightened her grip on my antennae, the chili oil on her knuckles smearing near my open visor. That agonizing, throat-melting spice invaded my lungs. She shoved the crude stone mortar right into my face, the retinal scanner at the bottom of the bowl lining up perfectly with my iris. The rough granite scraped painfully against my scales. I didn't even entertain the thought of resisting. I knew exactly what would happen if I balked. She'd flick that fungal mud off her boot straight into our water mains, and our entire orbital armada wouldn't even have time to warp. Trembling, I leaned forward, aligning my eye with the pale blue targeting reticle in the mortar. 3 seconds later, the jarring hum of authorization blasted through my skull. The second the scan completed, the authorization chime still echoing in my brain, my melting wrist monitor erupted in blinding blue light. The synchronized unlocking of the fleet-wide retreat order blasted through the interrogation room. The chili oil on Helen's fingers smeared against my visor as she finally released my antennae, brutally slamming her stone mortar onto my busted terminal. The interstellar holo broadcaster, hidden deep inside my hardware, popped out with a sharp click. She had mapped out every backdoor in my clearance while I was pinned. Coating her finger in toxic mushroom powder from the mortar, she hit the interface. A massive, brilliant blue hologram expanded, broadcasting on all frequencies. The pathetic footage of me kneeling to grant biometric authorization, flanked by 2 royal guards thrashing on the floor with purple, swollen gills and empty nano-med boxes scattered like trash, was instantly live-streamed 37 light-years away to the main screen of the Alliance Parliament. The broadcast channel dissolved into pure chaos. I could hear the panicked shrieking of high-ranking bureaucrats who had never stepped out of a sterile pod in their lives. One colonization senator triggered a psychosomatic anaphylactic shock and fell straight out of his hover chair. The concussive force of the orbital motherships burning their engines at maximum thrust shook the floor plates. USS didn't even bother moving the mountain of ruined nanofilters. His claws were a blur on the hyperdrive interface. The transport ships in the stratosphere didn't even bother reeling in their multi-million credit-heavy medical bays. They just dumped them out the airlocks into the open sky. Entire payload bays of gene-editing incubators and premium allergy meds rained down into the atmosphere, every airlock welded shut, nobody daring to take one last look at the dirt. The local gravity generators went haywire from the sheer mass of the fleet launching simultaneously. The broken hollow projectors rolled against my boots. The rear guard patrols didn't even bother locking their helmet seals. They scrambled for the drop ships, clutching their swollen gills. Nobody stopped to pick up the high-energy rifles left in the dirt. Helen, still chomping on that radioactive red ghost pepper, spat a seed right onto my melting monitor. She stepped over the trash pile of empty medical crates and walked toward the blown-out door, a tiny flake of that doomsday green fungus falling from her tread onto the sterile floor. I propped myself up on the freezing deck. My half-melted monitor was spazzing out, overwhelmed by global distress signals flooding in at 30 pings a second. The pepper seed Helen spat out rolled lazily across the blistering hot glass. The busted interstellar broadcast module was still humming. 37 light-years away, the Parliament was likely tearing itself apart over our live-streamed humiliation. 12 years of my life, 10 of them spent building the absolute most impenetrable biological defense grid in the galaxy. 2 million credits, a pop for military-grade filters, and we got absolutely leveled by a human-breathing chili powder. The chili oil smeared on my visor seeped inside, setting my remaining healthy gills on fire, sending me into a violent coughing fit. I looked up. Helen was still chewing on her prize, her boots dragging a chaotic green streak of fungal mud across the pristine white floor. She didn't even spare a glance for the discarded laser rifles that could melt a tank. To her, our million-credit ordnance was probably less lethal than the crushed toadstools in her rock bowl. As she stepped through the blasted doorway, she casually plucked a ridiculously red wild berry off a bush outside. My internal database flashed red. The cyanide levels in that single berry could wipe out an entire colonial transport ship. My muscles locked up into stone, assuming she was arming a dirty bomb. Instead, she just bit into it with a loud crunch. Deep purple juice ran down her jaw as she squinted in pure bliss, like she was eating a damn after-dinner mint. I stared at her, and the final circuit on my monitor fried itself with a pathetic hiss. I used to think the Alliance was exaggerating when they classed Earth as a maximum hazard bio-hellscape. Now I realize the rating was backwards. This planet isn't the hellscape we are. We are fragile glass toys spawned in sterile incubators, trying to step to a savage world that has been evolving teeth for billions of years. Our multi-million credit medical bays tumbling through the stratosphere, our crates of elite synthetic meds, 20 of our most expensive shock troopers, all completely neutralized by a broad with a ghost pepper, a moldy orange peel, and a clay bowl. Helen didn't look back, and she didn't throw out any cinematic one-liners. She just pointed a finger at the leftover orange peel sitting by my boot. The message was crystal clear. Bring your fleet back to my dirt, and I won't even need the moldy orange. One spore on the wind will wipe you out so hard you won't even leave ash. Her silhouette melted into the endless, deep green canopy, bathed in the sunset. With every step, lethal fungal fragments dropped from her boots, seeding the rot. In less than a week, they would grow into a brand new, completely natural minefield that our scanners would never detect. I leaned against the bulkhead, hauling myself to my feet, and looked up at the sky. The dense swarm of orbital motherships was burning desperate trails toward the hyperspace jump points. Across the fleet, thousands of respiratory distress alarms were wailing through the cockpits. The evening wind blew in through the ruined door, smelling of damp earth and rot. I didn't dare take a deep breath, but I could clearly smell it on the breeze, the faint sweet tang of chili peppers and wild berries. It was the ultimate warning, seared into the lungs of any alien civilization stupid enough to set foot on this biological hellscape.
Man, can you believe that? A multi-million credit alien armada absolutely wrecked by a badass chick with a ghost pepper and a moldy orange peel. Hell yeah. That visual of a high and mighty alien commander crying over some mud on a boot is pure gold. They thought Earth was a bio-hellscape? Buddy, they just met the manager. So crazy. I gotta know, if an alien death squad landed in your backyard right now, what toxic junk from your fridge are you feeding them to melt their armor? Drop it in the comments. And hey, if you love this wild ride, smash that like button and subscribe for more HFY madness. Catch y'all next time.